So for today, our lecture video will be the first part of a series on the integumentary system, or the skin. And let's just start with an overview. So it is an organ because it's made of multiple tissue types. And it makes up about 7 to 8% of our total body weight. And we know that it covers our entire body surface. And it's about 1.5 to 2 square meters total, and the thickness is somewhere, depending on where at, 1.5 to 4 millimeters thick. Now, we're going to look at the layers of the integumentary system, and really it's made up of 2 main layers. So we have a layer of epidermis, which is the most superficial layer, and then we have deep to that the dermis. Now we're going to divide, so each of those, the epidermis we can look at in terms of layers. So there would be 5 layers to the epidermis. And then we are going to look at the dermis. There's 2 layers of the dermis. The epidermis, so thinking about what we learned last week, different tissue types, the epidermis is made of stratified squamous epithelium. So stratified, if you recall, means more than 1 layer, right? Squamous is the shape of the cell. So these are going to be those look like flat fried eggs, right? So that's what the epidermal layers are made out of. Now the dermal tissue is actually, well, we'll see there's 2 layers, but it's made up of 2 types of connective tissue. So we'll look at that in more detail in a separate video. Now those 2 layers make up what we call the integument. Now deep to that is something called the subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis. Now, it is important because it's going to then bind the integument to underlying tissues, but it's not itself part of the integument. The subcutaneous layer, or also called the hypodermis, is made up of connective tissue. So it's made of adipose. Remember, that's fat, right? Adipose connective tissue and loose areolar connective tissue. Now, just to be able to remember the names of these. So derma means skin. So epidermis, dermis, hypodermis, right? We're talking about the skin. The prefix epi means above, over, upon. So the epidermis, right? Epidermis is at the top, right? Over the dermis. And then hypo means below. So if we think about the dermis, epi's above, hypo's below, hopefully that will help, so you don't have to just memorize so many things and you can just think about how they relate to one another. All right, let's take a minute and look at sort of an overview of the integument. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is notice that there are these sort of wave-like structures, okay, between, so you see that wavy area, okay? We'll talk about that. So those are called papilla or papillae, and they essentially increase the surface area of 2 layers so that the connection is better, right? There's more surface area to make a connection. So above that wavy area is the epidermis, and then below that, all the way down to about here, right, is the dermis. And then below the dermis would be the hypodermis. Now remember, technically the integument includes just the epidermis and the dermis. Now, I know there's a lot of structures listed on this, and we will get to those in a separate video. We're going to talk about all of these sweat glands, the sebaceous glands, all of those. But for now, I just want to introduce you to the basic layers, the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. Now, I do want you to see that the entire integument we talked about, right, is about 1.5 to 4 millimeters thick. So in terms of something that you can probably relate to, that's about 15 to 20 sheets of paper. But the epidermis is somewhere, depending on where it's located, is between 1 to 6 sheets of paper thick. All right, now we're going to start with the epidermis of thick skin. You don't have thick skin everywhere. Actually, you only have thick skin I'm going to just make a note here, on the soles of your feet and the palms of your hands. So areas where you're going to have more wear and tear, right, in those areas. So we would call that thick skin. And thick skin is going to have 5 layers. We'll talk about thin skin in a minute. It has 1 less layer. Thin skin only has 4 layers. So we've already mentioned that the epidermis is made of stratified, that's multiple layers, squamous, that's the shape, right, that flat fried egg epithelium. Now, when we talked about the different tissue types, we mentioned that sometimes stratified squamous is keratinized and sometimes it's not. So for skin, we're going to see that it is in fact keratinized, which makes it stronger. Now, we know that epithelial tissue is avascular, and so since the epidermis is made of epithelial tissue, it makes sense, right, that it would be avascular, meaning there are not capillaries in this layer of skin. So how does the epidermis get the nutrients, the gas exchange? It has to depend on the blood supply in the lower layer, in the dermal layer, right? Things diffusing into the epidermis. Now, the 5 layers are listed here, and I've listed them from deep to superficial. So in other words, stratum basale right here would be the deepest layer. So if we have that skin, so if we have this wavy part, right, and below that wavy part, that's the dermis. And so then the next layer that sits right there on top of those papillae would be the stratum basale, or we might sometimes just call it the basal layer. Okay. Now, the next layer above the stratum basale is the stratum spinosum, or we might call it the spiny layer. Then we have stratum granulosum, and we call it that because it looks granular under the microscope. It looks like it has little grains in it. And then I have this layer bolded, stratum lucidum, or the clear layer, because it's the one that is not present in thin skin. So thin skin has all the other 4 layers. And then the most superficial, or the top layer, would be stratum corneum. Corneum means horn, right? So this is the horn-like layer. We'll talk about this more, but this layer is actually a layer of keratinized dead cells. These cells are no longer living. Now, one easy way to keep these layers in order is the mnemonic, let's get sunburned. So we know one of the things we have to worry about with our skin is protecting it from UV light, right, to keep it from being sunburned. So if you use that mnemonic, it goes from the most superficial, stratum corneum, down to stratum basale. Now I want to take a minute and we're going to go through each of these layers and talk about some of the characteristics of the layers. So the deepest layer of the epidermis, stratum basale, is basically a single layer of stem cells. Okay, so we can see one of these papilla right here from the dermal layer, right, that's coming up. So we're going to have sort of a single layer they may appear cuboidal or columnar. They're still epithelial cells. And remember, we name the tissue based on what the cells look like, right, at the superficial side. So in this case, it's all still called stratified squamous epithelium. But this is really a single layer of cells. So when we look at models and when we're looking at histology, which we'll do a lot in the lab section, that's one thing to keep in mind. We're looking for a very thin layer, right, of one layer of cells for this basal layer. So it's attached to the dermis, the underlying layer, by those connections that we talked about previously, hemidesmosomes. And as I mentioned, it's these little folds, these papilla, that increase the strength of the connection because there's more surface area there. So if you think about like egg crates, the way those little egg crates are, when you connect those, it would be similar to that. So in this layer, we have, as I mentioned, stem cells or basal cells. These are keratinocytes. So what do you think keratinocytes do? Well, they produce keratin. And keratin is a protein that's going to make our epidermis or our skin stronger. And also we're going to see that it becomes water resistant. So one type of cell we find is the keratinocyte. Now, a stem cell or a basal cell just means this is a cell that's going to continue to divide, right, to produce additional keratinocyte cells. Now, another cell type we're going to see is a melanocyte. And thank goodness these cells sound a lot like what they make. So the keratinocyte produces keratin proteins. The melanocytes are going to produce melanin pigment. And you probably already know something about melanin. We know it has something to do with the color of our skin. But what's the purpose of melanin? Well, the purpose of melanin is to shield the nuclei or the DNA of these keratinocyte cells from UV harm, UV radiation. So that's why the more exposure we have to sunlight and UV radiation, it stimulates these melanocytes to produce more melanin pigment. So the purpose is protection from damage, right? But it also causes a darker color, right, in our epidermis. Now, another cell we'll see is, we might call these Merkel cells, or sometimes they're just called tactile cells. And these are a type of nervous sensing cell that is common in areas where we sense light touch. So, for example, you have a lot of these in your fingertips. All right, moving up from stratum basale, then we move up to stratum spinosum. And this is called the spiny layer. It's called the spiny layer. I'm gonna skip down here. Why is it called the spiny layer? It's because when tissues are prepared and stained and then viewed, the way that they're stained, the cytoplasm or the shrinks, right, in the cell. But the cytoskeleton that's there and the connections between these cells, and we learned about these a couple weeks ago, called desmosomes, that's what's holding those cells together, they stay. So it sort of makes it look spiky or spiny in appearance under the microscope. Now, stratum basale had one layer. Stratum spinosum is going to have more than that, about 8 to 10 layers, and these are still living. So stratum basale are the stem cells. They're dividing, and then they're sort of pushing cells up. In this next layer, we have living keratinocytes. They are eventually going to produce keratin, right, for our epidermis. And we also find a type of dendritic cell or an immune cell called a Langerhans cell. And so this is important for keeping bacteria, right, at bay, engulfing, phagocytizing damaged cells in the area. So we do have some immune activity in the stratum spinosum layer. All right, moving up, stratum granulosum. Now this one is a smaller layer than spinosum, just about 3 to 5 layers of still living keratinocytes. So as the cells in the basal layer, right down here, are dividing, essentially they're getting pushed up into stratum spinosum, and then as more cells divide and push those cells up, right, it just keeps pushing the keratinocytes up into the more superficial layers. So here's an important thing that we need to know about this layer, stratum granulosum, and that is the process of keratinization is going to begin. What does that mean? These keratinocytes are going to start producing the protein keratin. And this layer, notice in the figure, it looks like there's these small granules all within these cells. So that is the presence of this molecule right here, keratohyalin. And what this does, the reason it looks that way is because of the way the sample is stained, right? It accepts that stain. But this is an important chemical that's going to be present during the keratinization of the epidermis. Now, as this process occurs and the more keratin is produced, essentially the nucleus and the other organelles are going to disintegrate. So once a cell loses the nucleus and the organelles, it's no longer living, right? It's going to be a dead cell. However, it's going to be full of that keratin. So it's going to be sort of pushed up, okay, into this top layer, and it will remain there a couple of weeks. As the cells go through keratinization, they get flatter, and their membranes, their plasma membranes, actually get thicker, which helps with being sort of water, so we don't lose water, we don't absorb water, right? It makes it waterproof. Stratum lucidum, now remember, this is the layer that is only found in thick skin, only in our palms and only in the soles of our feet. So what that means is the majority of our skin is not thick, right? The majority of our skin is going to be the thin skin. But in thick skin, we have this extra layer. It's a couple of layers of dead keratinocytes. Remember, as they go through keratinization and the organelles and nucleus disintegrate, we end up with these dead cells full of keratin. Now, these are important in protecting from UV light in our thick skin. There is a protein here that causes them to be translucent, this layer. It's called elidin. It's a protein that is sort of a product of that keratinization process. Now, the most superficial layer, the one that you see, would be stratum corneum. And this is going to be a fairly large layer compared to the others because it has about 20 to 30 layers or sheets of dead, remember at this point they're dead, keratinocytes. So the nucleus, the organelles have disintegrated, and basically you see these cells that are just packed with keratin. They're dead. As I mentioned, these are going to hang around about 2 weeks, and then they just naturally get sloughed off. So as we begin at the basal layer and those cells begin to divide and they get pushed up into each layer and finally reach stratum corneum, it takes about 2 weeks from the time they originally are divide from the basal layer to get to stratum corneum, and then they are there for about 2 weeks. So, it's about 4 weeks or a month or so that cells hang around. Now, here's the key. As we age, guess what? Of course, things slow down a little bit. Okay, now at the surface, right, on the corneum layer, we do have exocrine secretions that are going to play a role in preventing microbial growth on our skin. And so we'll talk about that in a successive video. So I just want to summarize what we looked at. So we've looked at all the layers and we've looked at the types of cells that are in each layer. Remember, everything begins at stratum basale down here in the most the deepest layer of the epidermis. And as one of these stem cells divides, it pushes a cell up, right, into the next layer. And then as more cells are produced, it continues to push those cells up into higher layers. And through that process, what happens? Well, these keratinocytes make keratin. The nucleus and other organelles disintegrate. At that point, the cells are dead, right? As I mentioned, the plasma membrane gets thicker, and this helps with our being waterproof. It takes about 2 weeks, and then they remain about 2 weeks. So ultimately, we get tough, keratin-filled dead cells that have this water-resistant barrier. Now, if you look at your fingers, or if you've ever had your fingerprint taken, we know that we have these ridges, and we know they're unique to each individual. The fingerprints actually form in the basal layer, stratum basale. However, the actual ridges are due to the dermal layer underneath. Remember, we talked about the papillae that form that wavy pattern, and that's what the epidermis attaches to. So it's these projections or folds in the dermal layer that causes the fingerprints. So can they change if you get a burn or a scar? You can, right? But it has to be deep enough that it affects that layer.